Well, welcome, Jan Pfister. I'm so happy to have this conversation with you on performance management seen through the lens of a new paradigm. So, welcome.
Thanks very much for inviting. So looking very much forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And I'll have you introduce yourself in a minute, but I want to give an introduction of how I learned about you, and we started to work together. I've been working on evolution and everything, of course, forever, evolution and economics for a long time also. And most recently, my article with Dennis Snower titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Economics. And so evolution as a new paradigm, of course, is everything that I do. And so you contacted me because you had first authored a co-authored paper titled Performance Management in the ProSocial Market Economy, New Paradigm for Economic Performance and Sustainability. And so in the first place, I was just amazed by this article because of how much you had taken on the evolutionary paradigm and done creative things with it. So of course, that's always a delight. But also your entire field that you represent of performance management and management control systems was one that I was, I'd have to say, unaware of. And so the application of the profession that you were applying it to was new for me. I know something about management, business, and also systems engineering, but this was a subfield that was new to me. And it excited me because it struck me as it must be more down to earth than economics, because economics writ large, especially neoclassical economic theory, is awfully abstract and far away from practical applications. But performance management and management control systems must be very close to application. So that excited me. Anyhow, and then I became a co-author of the paper, which was just published. That's one reason that we're celebrating with this podcast. So please introduce yourself as a person and the professions of performance management and management control systems.
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor in management accounting, and that's basically a field. Even though it's situated in accounting, we have a broad interest in the management of organizations. So we kind of use the accounting internally in the organization, and what we do is in my area, so we are qualitative researchers. Means we go to companies, we study the managers and employees, and look at how do they manage the performance, and what do they use, and what is the culture that is developed. That's what I've been doing for the last 15 years, basically, and done field research in US companies in Silicon Valley, but also in Europe. And through that, basically, had various insights in how people work together, and also saw big differences in that. And I think that kind of inspired also this article, how we came to that.
So how did you, so is it safe to say that performance management is quite systemic? I mean, you're taking a whole organization perspective. When I think of neoclassical economics, one of the critiques of it is that it's highly individualistic and atomistic. Everything is boiled down to individual choice. But is it true that performance management and management control systems is in there as a word? Is it kind of inherently more systemic than that?
Yeah, I think it comes from the origins of the field, where there was a focus on relatively narrowly on systems to look at the targets, the measurements, and the performance evaluations, and then kind of seeing this as how that works in an organization. And that very much was kind of, the cybernetic feedback loop. And it was very much looking at it as a system that you have within the organization. And I think only then over time, so over the decades, different studies, there was a realization that, of course, you can't just study that part of the organization. When you study performance management, you need to take a really broad look at basically everything that a manager has available to influence the behavior and the performance of people in the organization. So, and I think nowadays we often talk about management control practices or other terms. So therefore, the systems part is sometimes a bit avoided. But then on the other hand, it is of course also very much in a system. And when you think of all those different practices, how they interact and how they influence the behavior in an organization, then you can also very much take a systemic look or a system theory look at how that influences the performance and the outcomes in organizations.
And like so many other fields, performance management has been influenced by neoclassical economics, and so let's cover that part of it. At what point did you've already talked it as a kind of a cybernetic ancestry, but nevertheless became influenced by neoclassical economics. So describe that intrusion.
Yeah. So I think one of the key purposes or how management control and performance management has been defined from the early times is always this focus that you have self-interested individuals and you have the organizational goal. And therefore you need to somehow make sure how you make an alignment between these individuals and the goals of the organization. And that has very strongly been pronounced in our field that, well, that's the typical focus. That makes sense. But what we now, and that's based on neoclassical economics, what we now basically looked at in this paper is that such a focus can also reinforce self-interest, because if you say that, well, people are self-interested in an organization and we need to very much focus on that and design the systems this way, that means we assume that people are self-interested, selfish, antisocial. We teach that in business schools, we teach that in consulting, we teach that everywhere. So that means it creates basically a broad assumption that people are this way. And the problem that this creates, in our view, is, well, if we assume all that we are this way, or that there is a high risk of opportunistic, so exploitative opportunistic behavior, that we act accordingly this way ourselves. So that's kind of the critique that we provide in this paper. And I think it's also very much, of course, built on your work, that we have to be aware of the effects of neoclassical economics in our field and how we replicate that in the narrative of the field in practice and in the research that we do. So therefore, this is the shift and one of the main critiques that we have, that we actually should then focus more on a pro-social perspective, because what is the alternative to thinking that people are self-interested and that we need to align them to the goals? It is that we think of how to create pro-social groups, and we kind of work on the, as a field, more on the ways how to create those pro-social groups. And that creates a different narrative, and that creates also different designs and uses of performance management in organizations. So
yeah, I mean, there's a sense of self-fulfilling prophecies, but we become what we assume. But there's also like unforeseen consequences. I think the general point, which we'll be returning to again and again, is that we're always seeing the world through one lens of another, some worldview. This gets into what in evolutionary terms we call dual inheritance theory, where our meaning systems are the cultural equivalent of our genes. And so every one of us has a meaning system, just like we have a set of genes, and which influence how we see the world and therefore how we act in the world. So there's tremendous flexibility. What we do depends on what we think. And so that's the whole concept of a lens. We always have a lens, and which one just is so consequential in how we see the world and how we act in it. How did you encounter the evolutionary pro-social perspective?
Yeah, so I think the starting point of this was that studying performance management and control in organizations and seeing just what's going on in the world in recent years. As we know, there are so many problems around, and then kind of evaluating all that we see in the world. A large extent of it is organizational behavior, whether you think of an organization, a company, a not-profit organization, even a country. All that is basically organizational behavior. And if you take that together, you can see, well, on the one hand, incredible achievements. I mean, what humans have created as organizations. But then the other side of this is that you see, well, pollution, global warming, all those problems. So where we went is to think about what would be actually the best behavior that organizations should have. What would be the ideal outcome? So really start with the end in mind, and then thinking, well, you want economic performance. That's clear. We are in a market economy, and whatever that economic performance means for different companies. So for some it might mean growth, but for others maybe there's also a realization that too much growth is not good. But I mean, whatever that outcome is, and at the same time you want to have behavior that is sustainable. So that really considers that we are all citizens in this global community, and that we have responsibility for each other and for nature. So based on that, we were kind of looking what would be that ideal behavior. And then, well, you get quite quickly to see that the behavior that causes a lot of difficulties and troubles is basically selfish behavior and antisocial behavior. And the opposite of that type of behavior is prosocial behavior. So that's kind of how, a few years ago, also in my case, through different studies that I have done and worked, I saw always it comes basically back to that problem. So I was kind of looking for different approaches, and then came the prosocial approach. I think I saw also, on the one hand, I found the book ProSocial that you have with your colleagues. And then I also saw, I think, some YouTube interviews with you where this also was presented. And then it made somehow became clear that this is something that actually should be included in the field of performance management and management control systems. And then additionally, I had the possibility to work with David Otley. So he is somebody that has been started his career in the late 70s, has had very influential papers in the management control field. And I have been working for a while in the same university. So we have had that relationship. And I also approached him with this and asking, so shouldn't we have a change here in that performance management view? And isn't that even almost a different paradigm? And it ended up being a really interesting discussion, because, I mean, he is in his late 70s, now 80, I think. So he's has been there for a long time, very much, ingrained into the way we think, and then being exposed to another view. But then at the same time, he has had a big openness to this, and started to question, because he sees the problems that are there in the world and that things are not right. And we had many calls, and there was a clear understanding that this should be done. And then he joined also this project and the funding application that we had with the Research Council of Finland. So we applied for the biggest funding that you can get in Finland for international projects. And that was an important part, that he was on board, and also to kind of evaluate this new view with a view from him who has represented a large part of that field as well.
That's great. And so just to recap, first of all, you engaged his interest, and then you got funding from Finland. But it's an international project. It's not confined to Finland. And maybe this is a good time to describe the project, and which resulted in the article, multi-authored article. Feel free to introduce some of the other co-authors. One of them is Solomon Darwin. I don't know if there's a direct connection, but who's known as the father of the smart village movement in India, which is an amazing movement and very much in line with ProSocial. And then this article, this was a milestone in this project. Are there other outputs you're expecting? So describe this project and this grant-funded project in more detail. Some of the people internationally that you brought together, and what are the outputs of this project? The article is a milestone, but maybe you'd like to describe the project more broadly.
Yeah. So actually, the co-authors of that, they were almost a bit kind of from different places where I worked and had connections, because Solomon Darwin was somebody I visited during my PhD. So when I did my PhD at the University of Zurich and worked on internal control, especially fraud and organizational culture. So that was my topic. And during that time, I visited the University of California at Berkeley for 2 years as a visitor, and Solomon Darwin was my host at the time. So he was at that time in financial accounting and reporting in that institute. He changed later to work together with Henry Chesbrough on open innovation, and worked with him also on all those issues, and hosts the Berkeley Innovation Forum, which is a forum for multinational companies where they come together. So with him, we have a long relationship on that. So over all those times, when I visited, that was 2007 and 8. And then later he got into smart cities and then smart villages. And that's something that he has done in India. And with another colleague, which is Sarah Jack. She's an influential researcher in entrepreneurship. Her I met when I worked in Lancaster, at Lancaster University. So I was in the accounting and finance department, but I was there a qualitative researcher in a department that was highly quantitative. And Sarah is a qualitative researcher in entrepreneurship. So that's how we connected at that time. And she also got to know Solomon. So we have kind of worked together or know each other from that time. So she then, or Sarah and I decided to study Solomon's Smart Village movement 5-6 years ago. So that has led to few visits in India and also in the US, and where we have an ethnography that we are working on currently about that project. So where we study Solomon, how he actually brings together different stakeholders in India.
Oh yeah, that's so important and so needed around the world. This idea of smart units, smart cities, smart villages, smart organizations, smart market economies. We're going to get to that basically when we talk about smart market economies. By definition, we're talking about a multi-group cultural ecosystem. How do we organize things at that scale? Well, the project that this paper is one outcome. Is there more outcomes that we can expect of this great collaborative effort that you've put together?
Yes, so there are several projects on the way. So also several other co-authors that I can't mention because there are 12
So
authors
many.
in the paper, and there are several great researchers and collaborators. So I just want to mention maybe Thomas Ahrens, a very influential management accounting researcher who has greatly contributed to it, and also Yuval Milo from finance in the finance area, and many others. So yeah, we have I think about 6-7 studies on the way on the ProSocial paradigm that we propose, and those studies are generally one study is about how this can be applied to accounting more generally, kind of connect that to accounting research. Then another study is about prosociality in academia. So how are academics pro-social, or is that less happening?
Yeah.
And there are variations, as we can see. And then we have a study on a technology company that has been a pioneering company in communication technology, and we study their history, and they have had a very particular performance management at the time. And that is totally aligned to a very large extent aligned with the pro-social paradigm and Ostrom's principles. So that's something we work on. And then the Smart Village Movement project that I just mentioned is one. And there is also a project on pro-sociality and digitalization, where we look at how can the digital space be used in a pro-social way and not in an exploitative, opportunistic way, as the capitalist system typically will very much automatically promote. So we think of how this can be studied from that perspective. So yeah, there are multiple projects on the way, and this first one, just also maybe briefly to mention how this paper actually happened, that there were 12 authors. So what we did is we had a year ago one workshop in Turku where all the project members were invited, so that we discussed these issues together, and you were invited as a keynote speaker at the time. And what we did as a preparation is each member wrote a short section, what they think about the project application and the pro-social approach. And then we had all these insights and all these different views, and then spontaneously kind of out of this developed then this paper from there, where in the front end is basically the paradigm, and in the back end the different reflections.
Yeah, and this is very convergent with some of my projects, as you know, through the New Paradigm Coalition, especially the concept of evolutionary case reports, which we're starting to do. And I think you have more experience than we do. But the idea that every organization has a history, which is basically a history of cultural evolution, and that we can take our pro-social lens and not only apply it to the present and future of organizations, but also to interpret their past. And that when you look at organizations, they might work well or poorly. When they work well, then the prediction is that it's because they have implemented these core governance design principles and also adaptability, that the common denominators for all organizations are to be well governed and to be adaptable. There's core principles for each of these, and successful organizations have converged upon these principles from 1,000 different directions. They describe them in different languages and conceptualize them in different ways. Hardly anyone's ever heard of Elinor Ostrom or frames it explicitly in terms of evolution. And so in that sense, the evidence for best practices is, as I like to put it, hiding in plain sight. And if you're not seeing it, it's because of the lens that you are viewing the world through. So the lens, in some respects, is everything in terms of non-blinding you. Religious imagery, such as the scales falling from your eyes, comes to mind. And in your paper, you have some really nice tables in which you have one column describes like what the neoclassical lens prescribes, basically what you see through the neoclassical lens, and then in another column what the ProSocial lens, evolutionary lens, prescribes. Could you give a sense of that, just that comparison of the neoclassical lens versus the ProSocial lens?
Yeah, so I think the key difference is what we talked about earlier, that the traditional view is you would align the self-interested individuals with the goals, while the pro-social paradigm would look at how can you create pro-social behavior and pro-social groups in organizations, which is a key difference for us. Then another one that I think is essential, what is the role of self-interest in this and opportunism? And what we see is with the neoclassical economic perspective, you almost cultivate self-interest in a way, because it is kind of, even though there is of course the discussion that it should be managed, in the end, paradoxically, due to the performative effects, it almost reinforces it. So that's a difference there, and therefore the pro-social perspective would more approach that to the opportunism. And I think a key difference is maybe the performance logic in these two that is essential. I think the neoclassical economic logic of performance is often that one compares with another to be better in performing. So that's kind of the goal. So as an individual, one needs to perform better than the one next to them. As a team, one needs to perform better, and as an organization needs to perform better. And when you think of the pro-social perspective, it's more of being of service. And being of service means that the individual should strive to become their best self, to serve in the best way, or the team should strive to become their best self to serve better. So I think there is a clear difference in that sense, what is seen as good performance. And that affects then also how you would design the incentives, the measures in an organization. You would probably go more for collective incentives rather than individual incentives and rewards. And then we also talk about the societal long-term impact of this and how it creates sustainability in organizations. So another key difference that is in this table is exactly that lens that you talked about. So is my lens that I'm an individual, a unit here in this planet, and I'm kind of independent of the rest? I just kind of, that's it. There are some other actors, but I'm very independent of those. Or is the worldview that, well, you're actually part of this species, and therefore, well, you are an individual, but at the same time, you're part of something larger as well, and you identify with this. And I think that's a very key difference in how you can see the world, and then also what effects it has on how organizing happens in that sense.
Yeah, let me break in, Jan, just to reinforce some of these things. I mean, it's hard. The idea that you're part of something larger than yourself, which is very valuable to you, so you willingly serve it. You're happy to subordinate your narrow self-interest to this thing that's larger than yourself because it gives you such a sense of purpose. That, I mean, it's the religious and spiritual mindset. But from an evolutionary perspective, when we think of ourselves as a highly cooperative species that always has existed in individuals, always existed in the context of highly cooperative groups, that's like a very natural state of mind to be a member of a highly cooperative group and to be so oriented towards it that you willingly serve it. So what's clearly has the earmarks of religion and spirituality is also needed, we are saying, in any organization in order to work well. And you can dress it up in religious language or not. You don't need to. It can be purely secular, but nevertheless, it's just like, I'm in this group, I'm in this organization because it's doing something very important. And that as a motivator stands in stark contrast to the individual motivator of I'm an individual, I have my preferences, I'm trying to maximize my preferences, and I'm in an organization that's been constructed so that I can do that. So there could not be a larger difference in psychological motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
well, and I think additionally to that is also that that the traditional view would say, well, actually you can regulate and you can have the market use the market mechanisms as for the organization, but also internally in the organization. And what we would say is that's not enough, because exactly you need to go kind of to the individual and include more self-leadership and self-responsibility, which is the pro-social paradigm that brings this in.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, competition is important. And any change is something, set of practices being adopted and others not being adopted. So competition is happening, but it's happening in the right places so that we're competing to be cooperative, basically. So speak a little bit about the role of constructive cooperation, competition, or the relationship between cooperation and competition. First, inside an organization, a single organization, and then next I want to bring in the topic of a pro-social market economy, which extends these ideas into multi-agent systems.
Yeah, so the role of competition, I think it is maybe useful to go to one of the core topics in our field, which is performance measures. So what we usually study is what can you measure and how can you use that, and what kind of what are the impacts of measures. And what research largely shows is, even though we want to measure everything in nowadays world, and we have now, of course, with AI, even more possibilities to make everything objective in measures, we also see that it can create a lot of problems, because there are always some dimensions that are missing, and there is also the problem that we then kind of take the measures for granted, that they say everything or speak the full truth.
Yeah.
And if you think of competition, so if we want to create internal competition in an organization, then we need to have very good measures so that we know who performs better and whom can we give the rewards and whom not. And if you think of, we have or have done a field study over a long time in an organization where they try to measure the productivity in much detail, and what it created is a lot of problems, because people are automatically unhappy about the measures. They feel devalued. Some feel valued, those that perform well, but others think they're not fully valued. So the long story short is, I think the pro-social paradigm would argue that there is much more cooperation needed, especially within organizations, and the competition should be a competition for pro-sociality. So is that what is providing a good service, and is it providing a better service maybe than another organization or another team? So is that what somebody, as an individual, an organization, a team, provides a good service? While when we think how the current market economy works, it's often efficiency is the number one. It is all about cutting costs, making things more efficient. And by that, often a lot of the service actually falters. And you can go into different industries, healthcare, education to some extent, all kinds of areas where this is a problem. So I think that's the change of the competition. And then
I think that's,
yeah. Sorry, just one last thing. The competition should be ethical and in a sense, like in sports, fair play sports.
Yeah, no, sports is a wonderful example, and it's a wonderful example of actually multi-level selection, because there's so much quantification. I want to talk a little bit more about like qualitative versus quantitative, but there is a small but fascinating literature on performance of sports teams needing to be pro-social. So that if you have a team where there's a big income disparity and some star players are being paid a lot and so on and so forth, they don't perform well as teams. So all of that is laid out and so competition is intense in team sports, but it's refereed, it's regulated, and so competing to be pro-social is what it's all about. And then just as the individual subordinates themselves in a good way to the goals of the organization must subordinate itself in a good way to the larger system, all the way up multiple tiers, ultimately with the global welfare in mind. And when we think of this from an accounting standpoint, I wanted to get back to that. What does this mean for the accounting profession? It does, I mean, terms such as social accounting comes to mind, that you have to account for your externalities. You can't just impose your externalities on others. So is that what form pro-social accounting takes? Is that it's accounting for externalities and basically bearing responsibilities for them? The B Corp movement comes to mind, but I'm not sure if you're familiar. I know you know about the B Corp movement, but speak a little bit about what pro-social accounting looks like.
Yeah. Well, I think in accounting, it's a very big topic, the ESG reporting. So for financial accounting, and then also to some extent, discussion is in management accounting. So these are the two, internal versus external accounting. And that's a big topic, but I think a main issue is, well, you can measure and report on the externalities of an organization, but if the culture of the company is in a way not believing into, fully believing in that the environment should be protected and all these criteria that the ESG has in it, then of course you have immediately hypocrisy. So then it's reported, it's done as a checklist, but not much more. And that's something where we believe that the pro-social paradigm could actually help and contribute to that literature by really going into the companies and changing the cultures. So let's say if practitioners pick it up, but also as researchers that we can discern much better through the lens what is actually pro-social and what is more opportunistic behavior, and also those that create hypocrisy. And additionally to that, I think what the pro-social paradigm does is it evaluates and rewards different types of behaviors. And that means also that over time, different types of people would come to the top of an organization. So because different behaviors are rewarded in the organization and normalized, and that's pro-social essentially, that means you have likely on a more general level, executives, senior managers, board members that have come to the top that think this way. And that has a big impact because it's the tone at the top that changes the organizations. And if those people at the top have been basically trained with the old paradigm, and that's the behavior that they believe in, while you should actually change that.
Yeah, that's something I'm learning. That's something I'm learning in my own investigation of organizations. On the one hand, the core design principles look like they're quite flat in terms of distributing power and decision making and so on to all members of the organization. There's a sense in which every member needs to be a leader within their domain. This is sometimes called a leader-leader model as opposed to a leader-follower model. But on the other hand, almost seems like the opposite, that there needs to be strong top-down leadership, almost something that looks like a typical business hierarchy, but the leader must be a servant leader. The leader is moderating this, and but to locate power basically in a benign sense in an individual rather than making it totally distributed turns out to be just the best way to do it. So that's been something I've discovered on the basis of my own inquiries. So there's still a need for strong leadership as long as it's of the right kind.
I think that's something we see with discussing the pro-social approach in relation to performance management, and especially if you think of implementing these core design principles from Ostrom, that those require more leadership effort. So to make those happen, you can't just, for example, set a target, measure, and see whether people achieve it. Then you don't actually implement them. So it means leaders really need to ensure that there is the transparency and there is, for example, the pro-social behavior rewarded. And also if it's not happening, so if there is unhelpful behavior, that this becomes just more normal to then also address these people. You know, I think nowadays in organizations, it's often not acceptable to say, look, this kind of behavior is opportunistic. This is not okay for us, because there is no tool to say that. But when an organization decides, well, we are a pro-social organization, then it's almost like you have a card here, say, hey, we are a pro-social organization. This is not what we do here. And by that, there is a means or a tool to actually correct that kind of behavior if it's exploitative or opportunistic. So I think that's something. And then the other way that came to mind also before when you mentioned neat empirical evidence. So what we say in that paper is, well, there are these core design principles and they can be implemented in various ways. I think that's what Ostrom's research also shows. So they are broad principles, and then depending on the industry, depending on the context, they are very differently implemented.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction. Yeah.
And I think for our field, this opens a possibility to study that. So how is it implemented in different ways, and what is the evidence for those pro-social organizations, and how well do they perform? So that's a lot of work that kind of could be done based on this, and should be done based on this proposal.
Well, one of the things I've discovered in my own inquiry this, I spend a lot of time looking in detail at organizations just as you do now, and I'm so impressed that the high-performing organizations, how much time they invest on curating their culture. Enormous amounts of efforts are are spent just creating the culture of the organization, which you might think takes away from day-to-day operations. And often a business will tell you, oh, we're so busy that we can't do anything new. We can't afford any time. But the high-performing organizations do that. And when you ask them, as I have, they say, well, it's not like these are not separate from each other. We don't meet any more often than any other business meets, but we do it in a way that's attentive to the culture of our organization. And over the long term, that's why we perform as well as we do. And there's so much attention to the welfare of the members of the organization. It goes on, and so it's really amazing to look on the inside of a high performing organization, and then to see it, and again they say, this is unlike anything you learn in business school. Like Bob Chapman of Barry Waymiller, one of my favorite examples, says, people, all these business gurus come and they look at our company and they say, Bob, I've never seen anything like it. And but it's out there. In fact, it's more common than you might think that organizations of no thanks to business school have happened upon these packages of best practices. So it's out there. If you're not seeing it, it's because the lens that you're wearing. I want to talk about adaptability, because often the discussion of the core design principles crowd out which concerns governance at any particular time, the need to change and adapt, and to always be assessing your practices and then capable of changing them. And that is inherently a process of conscious evolution. You have to have a target, large or small. You have to try different stuff out. There's your variation. And then you have to notice what works best and retain it or replicate it. And you have to do that again and again and again. That's what it means to be agile or flexible or adaptive. And once again, the high-performing companies, they do this, but how they envision it, how they describe it to themselves, and the specific ways that they do it are typically highly unique. They're historically unique, and they're contingent on the particular culture. But speak to me a little bit about adaptability per se, and as a process of conscious cultural evolution, basically.
Well, I think an example that comes to mind is a case study that we have been studying. It's actually Skype, or the origins of Skype. And the interesting aspect of that is that the company used its own communication technology as a control mechanism within the organization, not knowingly that they actually used that for that. But because what they did, so they were some of the pioneers in using digital communication. And by realizing that, well, you actually can communicate this way, and you can work remotely, and you can have different facilities, but at the same time, you are transparent because everybody sees all the time what's going on through the chat function. So they used that to a large extent. And then they had also a specialty that their senior managers, they had an IT background, but they were not really from a business school. I mean, some were, but those that were really doing the operations, they didn't have that background. So they would manage the organization very much ad hoc, as a startup entrepreneurship. But the company became very quickly large, global global organization, and they managed to do that without a lot of the traditional controls. So with a lot of these detailed measures, the target setting, all those things were very much in the background. It was about doing the mission, doing all those core design principles. And through that, the company was able to be adaptive and go into different markets very quickly, build new facilities, but then also when they had to change the strategy, they would adapt that very quickly. So that's an example that comes to mind where this adaptability has worked really well and where these core design principles are in place. And another company that comes to mind is a large US technology company where we studied the stretch targets. So how does the company achieve these very difficult targets? And how can you create, basically what you just described, the environment where people are willing to do really tough, to follow up on really tough targets. What needs to be done? And they have exactly that. A lot of personnel control, so the hiring, they will be very strict on that, who that they actually hire. They would set up all these nice environments that this happens, but then they have also this very strong team spirit and the identity, identity with the organization, that they know they are at an outstanding place to work. And also the mission of the organization has been inspiring to these people. And through that, they are willing to work then a bit beyond what maybe others want to work. And of course, there's always pros and cons to that. Because you can say, of course, you can create this really nice organization that almost is a cult. I mean, not really a cult, but a nice environment, and then people can also get exploited, right, by working too much. So it's pros and cons.
But I mean, there's outstanding examples of companies that understand that a person has multiple life roles, as they'll put it, and that it's the purpose of the company to respect them and nurture them, and so it's the opposite of turning you into a workaholic and just having so purpose driven that you burn out with other aspects of your life. And still, with that kind of generosity towards the individual, what that results in is happy, thriving employees. Who, so it's amazing the degree to which you can have your cake and eat it too. That's not just a unrealistic thing to say. We could spend a lot of time on all of these things, Jan, but I want to graduate from the level of a single organization to multi-group ecosystems in the concept of a pro-social market economy. So a market economy, by definition, is a multi-agent system. It includes many businesses and other entities. And if it's totally laissez-faire, then we know that's not going to work. Something you say in the article, and which I often say, is that laissez-faire won't work, and centralized planning won't work either. There's something else that's needed, which is basically a managed process of cultural evolution, but this time at the scale of a whole market economy. So speak to me about your vision of a market economy, which, after all, if we're calling it a market, then it's going to be competitive. So we're not being anti-market here, not at all. We're all about markets and entrepreneurship and rewarding innovation and all of that, but somehow in a way that's directed towards superordinate goals, ultimately the global welfare. So speak to me about how you think about pro-social market economies.
Yeah, so how we got to that topic from basically performance management is really that we started to think about how to manage teams, how to manage organizations, and the cultures, as we just before talked about. And then the idea is, well, if companies embrace more this pro-sociality, and also if it becomes more obvious that actually you perform also better, because as we just said, people go to work and they are basically excited to go to work, and they are excited to work together, and they flourish in that way. Then this becomes more of a norm, that this is kind of how we organize companies and organizations. And that means if this becomes more visible, and if that also performs well, then there is a trend more going in that direction. So it sets basically another best practice in a market. And I think as an employee, it's quite easy. If I want to be hired by a company, well, I will probably prefer the company where there is a good environment rather than where there is less of that. So that means we see it more as over time that this could really change the cultural norms in the market economy, and basically through competition, because it is the competition through pro-sociality. Those companies that offer more of it will, according to that premise, outperform those
cooperative groups beat selfish groups. Yeah.
Yeah. And the pro-social market economy as such is really one based on evolutionary theory, founded in that, and then looking at cultures and how to change the cultures with bringing more self-responsibility and self-governance into organizations. And that kind of is then a bit different from other concepts that look more at the regulatory space, circular economy, or the Nordic model, or others, which are more about regulating and the welfare state, while the pro-social market economy targets really basically the core of organizational behavior by looking at how to change that.
Okay, so I feel, let me maybe ask the same question another way and bring in a place-based element to this, which I want to end our conversation on. So this can manifest anywhere. That's point one. I think that's pretty clear from our conversation. It easily leads to collaborations that are not place-based, such as the coalition that I've built. ProSocial has built through the New Paradigm Coalition, and basically the coalition that you've built with this project. It's international. It can choose projects anywhere. But I think we will both agree that there's an added value in making this kind of synthesis place-based. Let's say a city, just to pick a unit, could be a nation, but let's say a city. And at that point, if we want it to be a smart city, to use that term, then we have all these problems we want to solve, problems of equity and poverty and distribution, and just, just think of all aspects of a city. And we've already said laissez-faire doesn't work, so that if we don't regulate it at all, and you just let people pursue their entrepreneurial impulses, they might succeed as businesses, but the larger system, that will not contribute to the larger system. So something has to happen to orient market forces towards what needs to be done at that scale, so that they basically, you need to form targets of selection that wouldn't exist otherwise. Orient variation on the target, select best practices, do the whole variation, selection, replication cycle. But at the level of this meso unit, such as a city. And so that's what one version of what a pro-social market economy might look like. Does that correspond to your vision? Do you have examples of it? Can you imagine how that is taking place? Because we do have our success stories. So there probably are examples of that. But so just comment on my portrayal of a market economy oriented around a real physical unit, such as a city or a nation or a bioregion. It doesn't have to be a political unit. Probably should be a bioregion, because everything is ultimately tied to the environment.
Yeah. Well, something we are planning to do is essentially here in Finland, replicating the New Paradigm Coalition that you have set up at the global level. And the idea here is to bring together in Finland people from various backgrounds, so whether they are academics, businesses, politicians, anybody basically that has a strong drive for this view that the new paradigm or the pro-social paradigm promotes, that they do something in this way. And what we want to do is bring them together on that local basis, and then essentially discuss this. So what is this pro-social paradigm? What is the difference to the existing perspective? And then, of course, all these people have a wealth of knowledge of their own areas and their own localized knowledge. And we hope then that through that discussion, that this pro-social paradigm basically inspires in some sense and provides a connecting point so that the different parties can learn from each other, and that there is also something to work towards. I think, as you also write in our article, that there is a paradigm that can be criticized, but there needs to be also an alternative to work towards. And the idea here is, to bring people together on a regular basis from very different areas, and through that have this discussion ongoing. And essentially it's an exchange of those ideas, and then everybody goes to their own area and maybe influences this in one way or another. As I guess, it is important that you have all the different sectors, all the different environments involved in that. And that's, Finland is a relatively small country, and it has probably also it has that background where the pro-social market economy is maybe closer to some other countries to implement.
It does. I think that the Nordic countries have a head start. In a sense, I think that we've already said that at the level of corporations that they vary in how well they implement these core design principles. You might call that natural variation. Same's true at a national scale. And so when we look at national comparisons, then we see the Nordic countries and Switzerland, by the way, your native country of Switzerland, they're high performing as nations, and they actually do at that scale tend to implement the core design principles already built into their cultures, and that includes their economy. So I've spent most of my time studying Norway this way, but I think it holds true for all of the Nordic countries that there's a strong labor sector, there's a strong business sector, there's a strong government sector. They all have power and they work collaboratively for the common good of the nation for the most part. And so they take a systemic approach. And also, as small nations, they tend to be peace advocates for peace at the international scale. That's true of relatively powerless agents at any scale. Peace. Can we be peaceful, please? I'm a small person. So that they tend to be agents of peace. So do you have anything to say about Finland and Norway and the Nordic model as a exceptionally good starting point? Just like businesses sometimes do this well, they've converged upon it. So also for nations.
Well, I think this country, as well as Switzerland, which is a bit different, some similarities, of course, to Finland. I think these countries have definitely a good starting point, but then we have to be, I think, also realistic. I think the businesses are still operating very much in the traditional paradigm, also in these countries, and especially the global companies. They are designed this way.
Yes.
And I think that's why it will, of course, require quite a bit of a rethinking of those structures, and it will require a bit of time that companies consider changing those structures, and also it needs more empirical proof that this is really working. Even though I think the core design principles, when you look at them, they're the most self-evident normal good practice. Like in any workplace, in any team that one has experience, could just sign that this is like what we would expect it to be. So therefore, it is in a way surprising that it needs empirical evidence to support that, because it is almost like rational thinking. But I think that needs to be done to convince more.
Well, Thomas Huxley, upon encountering Darwin's theory of natural selection, said, "How stupid of me not to have thought of that." So I think the core design principles have that quality. Yeah, there's a 1 + 1 = 2 moment. How stupid of us not to have thought of that. So that's what awaits us. I think this is great, Jan. This is so exciting, and although there's many reasons to be excited, I think the idea of applying these principles not only in general, every sector of our lives, anywhere, any place, anything, that to actually be putting down roots in particular places and bringing all the stakeholders together in a place really adds something in terms of implementation, of course, but also in terms of just purpose and passion, that when you do this, then I think it's going to be even more motivating to do this where you live, in all the contexts that mean the most to you. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the near future, the very near future. And so happy for your participation.
Well, thank you very much, and it's just a pleasure also to working together with you. I really enjoy it. So